The rocking chair moved, even though no one was sitting in it, back and forth, slow, patient, as if someone invisible still believed a baby would come back. Amanda Okoro watched it from across the drawing room, her hands resting on the curve of her belly, her heart beating in a rhythm that no longer matched the house. Outside, Lagos burned with lights and noise. Inside, the mansion held its breath. Money had filled every corner of the space. Marble, glass, silence. But warmth had long since slipped through the cracks. Here's the first thing you need to know. Babies don't just vanish from houses like this, not from homes with guards at the gates, not from families powerful enough to bend laws, and not without someone being blamed. And when the baby disappeared, the world needed a suspect. So they chose the easiest one, the poor mechanic. But before we get there, let me tell you why this story is already dangerous. Amanda Okoro wasn't supposed to be pregnant. Doctors said it for decades. Her family believed it. Her board depended on it. At 65, pregnancy wasn't just unlikely. It was a threat to inheritances, to reputations, to carefully written futures. And the father? Not a man with influence, not a man with lawyers, just Jacob, grease under his fingernails, a rented room above a mechanic's yard, a man who fixed generators by day and carried hope like a liability. The kind of man society already knows how to destroy. Here's a curious detail most people missed: the night the baby vanished. Jacob wasn't even in the house, yet by morning, his name was everywhere. And that raises a question you should keep in mind as you watch. Who benefits when a poor man is blamed for something he didn't do? And who was terrified of what that baby might become? Because this wasn't just about love, and it wasn't just about class. It was about bloodlines, about documents locked away, about a truth that couldn't survive daylight. In a few minutes you'll learn why the rocking chair never stopped moving that night, what security cameras didn't record, and why the baby's disappearance triggered a chain of decisions that can't be undone. But before the story goes any further, if you're drawn to dark stories where power crushes the powerless, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who never looks away from the truth. It tells YouTube this story deserves to keep unfolding. Now listen carefully. Amanda Okoro built this house after a funeral. Walls raised to keep memory out. Wealth taught her rules. Keep grief quiet. Keep schedules clean. Keep your face composed. This pregnancy was her rebellion. And Jacob? Jacob was the mistake the world was waiting to punish. Because when the baby vanished, the house didn't just lose a child. It chose a villain. And once a story like this chooses its suspect, the truth doesn't get a vote. The rocking chair moved, as if someone invisible still wanted to hold a child. It creaked in the hush of the drawing room, a slow, patient motion that kept time with Amanda Okoro's heart. Outside, the Lagos skyline was a blur of distant lights and indifferent traffic. Inside, the house wore the kind of quiet that settles over rooms when money has filled them, but warmth has leaked away. Amanda sat with both palms on the curve of her belly and hummed a lullaby she could no longer remember the words to. The melody was all she had for a future she could not touch yet, an investment in hope. She had built the house after the funeral, raised walls and glass like a hedge against her own memory. Wealth had come with rules. Keep grief tidy, keep appointments punctual, keep appearances sharp. The pregnancy had been a choice that felt like revolt, late in life, against the calendar of other people's expectations. Jacob, scruffy, soft-handed Jacob, who fixed the trucks and the leaking generators and who could, when he tried, make her laugh until she forgot that her husband's chair was empty, had been reckless enough to love her back. He was not a match on paper. He never had been. He carried grease under his fingernails, not pedigrees. He lived in a rented room above a mechanic's yard where the smell of oil and diesel formed a permanent fog at the back of his throat. He was, in all the ways that counted to polite society, a man who belonged elsewhere. Amanda did not mind. She had given him a name, and sometimes, in the soft darkness before dawn, she imagined a life where social lines blurred with enough stubbornness. Those nights were the ones she clung to now, between checkups and PowerPoints and the hush of a life that needed one small incandescent thing to fill it. She had not expected to be fighting other claims on that light. Her twin sister, Amaka, arrived like a rumor, words that grow legs and move quick. Where Amanda's sorrow had been a slow, private thing, Amaka had always been fireworks. Sharp opinions stored like knives, a smile that never quite touched the eyes. The years abroad had sharpened her language into charm and made her resentments into polished arguments. When she said she was coming back, she said it like relief. The house opened its doors like an invitation. Amanda, alone and tired, welcomed her. Amaka's sons, Chisholm, who had the sly stillness of a boy who watches for exits, and Emma, whose face was smooth with the complacence of the well-fed, arrived with their own pockets of quiet. On the surface, they were a family in reconciliation. In private, they were gears calibrated to a hunger Amanda could not name until it pressed against her like a hand. On the night the labor began, the house shed its certainty. The storm that rolled in over the city felt like a script for something large. Rain blotted the garden lights until the world dissolved into silver streaks. Amanda, with the sweat of effort and a nurse's reassurance, tuned every sound, the steady beep of monitors, the nurse's soft instructions, into a single channel of focus. Jacob had promised to come. He called once, twice, then the line went quiet. The phone on the bedside table became an accusing thing. His absence felt physical, a hole at the edge of the room. In the labor between contractions, Amanda imagined his hand on her forehead. She imagined the smell of oil and soap, the scrape of work clothes against her skin, the awkward tenderness he kept like a secret. The baby arrived with a cry that seemed to separate the air. The nurses exhaled. The midwife laughed with a tired happiness that might have been borrowed from other women before her. The boy, pink and small and unclaimed by history, opened his eyes, as if the room had been waiting. Amanda's first glimpse was of a face that belonged to her, to Jacob, to a shorthand of belonging that was older than the registrar's ink. For one perfect, blindingly bright minute, the world fit. Amid that minute, Amaka came in like a soft-set sun, all reconciliation and arms that touched hands too long to be casual. She hugged Amanda, as if they were children again, as if every last year of hurt could be smoothed. She arranged herself near the nursery doorway and watched with an expression that could only be read by someone who knew her. She had come for the child as much as for the sister. In her eyes there was a ledger open with old entries. Down the hall, Dr. Admi walked with the fatigue of a man making too many late-night calls. The doctor was small and nervous around money. He had a family, bills, a mortgage on a house that creaked in the tide of urban inflation. He had made choices at the edges of need before. Amanda trusted him because she had to trust someone. Amaka watched him because she had to know whose line to touch. The hospital that night smelled of sterilizer and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. Nurses moved through the nursery like careful ghosts. Babies slept in their bassinets, small chests rising and falling. The exchange, when it happened, did not feel like cinema. It happened in jerks of breath, and in the way a hand slides a folded thing into a pocket. It happened in a sequence of glances. Amaka's smile steady, Admi's hesitation, then the brief, quiet shuffling that a busy ward will not note. No one shouted. No doors slammed theatrically. In the middle of the ordinary, the extraordinary was arranged. Amanda left the hospital with arms that wanted to be full. The woman who handed her the infant said all the right things. "He's healthy. All is well." Both mother and child are recovering. The baby fit in her arms with the ease of something that had always been meant to be there. She thought she knew the shape of him, already named, already loved. And she believed the woman in the green gown who told her the eyes were fine. At home, she bent daily over the small face and hummed words that might be songs and might be prayers. The child's eyes were clouded, though. They held a light dimmer than she had imagined. Doctors described it with the clinical evenness of people who had to explain misfortune routinely. Congenital issues, early infant opacity, treatable maybe, treatable perhaps. Amanda accepted the diagnosis the way people accept weather. She arranged specialists, called friends, made a private schedule of hope and possibility. The child, Peter, because names are small promises, learned her scent and the cadence of her voice. Each night she listened to his breathing and tried to will clarity into his vision by sheer intensity of attention. If she had noticed the way Amarka's smile became something else when she thought none of them watched, she might have asked. If she had forced the hospital to show her every corner of its logs and privacy-protected rooms, she might have put a different ledger down on the table. Instead, she folded her energy into the boy whose skin smelled of hospital cotton and milk. She was, in those years, a presence that circled his needs like a satellite around a small world. Outside the house, the city did what it always did. It ignored individuals and made time into a currency that bought and sold small tragedies. At the orphanage, a different child grew in bad light and worse food. Philip, Amanda's biological son, whose name had been marked in her heart like a second heartbeat, learned the grammar of scarcity. He was bright. He was small-limbed in a way that made his energy look like a misdemeanor. The orphanage was a place where institutional efficiency ate tenderness for breakfast. A woman named Sister Ebele kept the records and knitted her hands until they were thin with motion. She did not have time to weep over each child. Philip learned to be invisible and sharp enough to keep the caretakers. He learned to read with a hunger that could be quiet, like prayer, years unspooled. Peter, at home, was given the world in the ways that money could buy. Tutors, specialists, the thick, careful patience of a woman who would not be abandoned again. He grew, but the blindness shaped him. How he put his hands around a cup, how he oriented to the mug's rim. The household filled with instruments of care, cane, braille books, an array of aids that made the house hum like a workshop. The staff learned his rhythms. The lullaby returned as a motif, a low thread through Amanda's day. Jacob watched with a different gravity. He loved the boy both for the love of the baby he believed to be his, and for the satellite of Amanda's happiness. He visited when he could. Cheap bus rides, the slow arithmetic of earning enough wages, the awkwardness of stepping into rooms where he had to be polite to men who never had him. The visits were small rebellions from a life he could not leave. A night spent on the sofa listening to Peter breathe. A morning where he tried to learn the names of the buttons on a braille phone. He bore the look of people who have to make themselves smaller to fit into spaces that were not designed for them. When he left, he carried with him the residue of hands that had been held, a warmth that lasted until the next calloused day at the shop. Something else moved quietly beneath the household's surface. Chisholm's smiles were a study in patience, practiced for the sake of trust. He learned how to be kind in the drip fashion of a man who wanted to be near someone, and who also wanted to hurt them. When he was alone with Peter, he showed a kinder face that had been rehearsed in the mirror. When he was in the dark, when the house's staff did not watch, his moods became another thing. The boy's cries were like keys, and Chisholm tested which ones opened doors and which ones made people close down. Peter's confusion, his sudden flinches, the way he would move like a man trying to find a light switch that was not there, those things did not bring Chisholm sorrow. They brought him a small, private power. Jacob saw some of that. He noticed the marks that were not before, the shuddering that once had seemed benign. He spoke to Amanda in halting words. She brushed his concerns like cobwebs, both unwilling to believe her household could harbor malice and afraid of the idea that family could be a weapon. When Jacob pushed, Amaka's smile hardened. "You are a good man," she told him once, in that particular tone that closed arguments. "You must not muddle what you do not understand." The money came like a rain in drought. Amanda, in private, slipped an envelope to Jacob in a small, unremarked corner of the house. Cash for a roof leak, cash for Mariam's medicines, cash to tide over the months when jobs dried. Jacob accepted the money with a grateful but guilty look. It was charity dressed as care. He did not know that gratitude could be turned into a noose. The seasons moved with a cruelty that felt like design. A bruise that had been explained away one day became something the child could not manage the next. A fall down a stairwell in the orphanage that left Philip bleeding. The kind of injury that forces names into systems. A wound that demanded tests. The hospital where the boy was treated issued one of those small, bureaucratic documents that set machines in motion. Blood samples, a genetic panel requested by a surgeon who wanted certainty, an errant comment from a technician, the kind of small administrative ripple that can turn into a wave. When the results did not mean what people expected, suspicion, like a fungus in damp soil, took hold. Someone on the ward mentioned that neither Amanda's hospital records nor even Jacob's blood type matched the injured boy catalogued as Philip where he had been registered. Rumors once born do not check for accuracy. They grow teeth. The first person to tell the story in the neighborhood was a woman who liked to be early onto news that gave her purpose. The second was a delivery man who had seen Jacob leave the house late one night carrying a small package. Social memory is malleable. Once a picture is painted, it becomes easier to fill. Chisholm learned the value of a picture. He watched Jacob leave at night and waited until the back lane had no mothers standing on doorsteps who could see lighted windows at suspicious angles. He set into motion things that looked small and natural. A post on a neighborhood forum hinting that the mechanic had been seen at odd hours. A grainy snapshot sent to a local blogger of a man exiting the property. He did not need to write the story. He needed only to scatter breadcrumbs that made an accusation feel inevitable. He also needed a device no one asked questions about, a tiny, unremarked tag, slipped into the strap of Jacob's worn bag, something he wore every day because he liked to keep a small stack of tools with him. The tag would tell a story in the wrong hands. It would record journeys in a timeline that could be read like intent. The act of planting it was intimate and slow, the placing of an object where it would be found later, the same method as sowing a seed. The envelope disappeared one night from the corner where Jacob had left it, a bundle of cash wrapped in paper, and turned up at the police station as an exhibit that seemed to say more than it needed. A nosy neighbor swore they had seen Jacob leaving the house with something small and heavy. A minor blogger with too many hours and a hunger for outrage assembled half photos and half lies into a narrative that smelled like something the public would consume. Mechanic who loved the heiress now vanishes child. The headline might have read if headlines were kind. Police came because murmurs were now calls. They came to Jacob's small house at dawn and made the kind of noise that wakes a neighborhood. Boots on stairs, the clipped manner of officers who have a script and a quota. Jacob had never been to a station as a defendant. He had once signed a paper when he missed a payment somewhere. He had never been treated as though his life could be dismantled by rumor. The men who asked him questions wore the polite indifference of people who are sure the world divides cleanly into those who are guilty and those who are not. They asked about the nights he had spent at the mansion, about the envelope, about whether he had taken the child. The questions were not gentle. They were instruments meant to frame. Jacob's answers were the looks of a man who has been stripped of armor. He said what he could remember and what he could not. His voice was small in the room that smelled of bleach and coffee. He felt accused not just by their eyes, but by the spaces he had once crossed without notice. He saw no faces of the men who had beaten his door one night, who had left him with more than pain. They had left a warning. A neighbor had seen men moving at the edge of his compound. The mechanics in his yard shook their heads and whispered, "Stay out of her house," they said, as if that could be a crime. For Amanda, the first time she heard the rumor, it felt like a hand closing around her throat. She had not been there when the list of accusations started to gather. Her life, business meetings, pediatric appointments, counseling for a child whose eyes did not answer, had kept a steady, contained trajectory. When a small reporter called with a soft voice that held the possibility of agreement, she stiffened as an older woman does when a child tells a lie about another child. She found it impossible to believe the accusation against Jacob, this man who loved her with a timidity that was almost religious. But the internet has a way of smoothing doubt. A photo of Jacob leaving the compound circulated, grainy, the kind of image that becomes proof by assembly. The envelope that once had been an intimate charity found its way to the front desk of the police. A clerk had declared it evidence. Who had given it? Who had seen the exchange? No one could say for sure. People repeated things because repetition made falsehood heavy as fact. Amanda felt the world recombine itself around a new axis. The missing baby was no longer an absence. It was an accusation against the only man who could not defend himself in a language the rich understood. She knew the stakes in a way that made blood run cold. She could lose a child and a reputation, and the same hands that lifted cups for her could turn their fingers into fists. She met Jacob's eyes for the first time across a table in a small interrogation room where she had not meant to be. The room smelled of cheap wood and fear. He looked like a man who had been dredged up from the bottom and placed under a microscope. His hands were raw from work. There was a bruise blooming along his jaw where someone's fist had settled the week before. Mariam, his wife, stood at the doorway with a face like a battle shield, angry, protective, exhausted. She had a right to be furious in a way that was purely human. Her home had been violated. Her husband had been humiliated. Her children had witnessed the world choosing new punishments for them. The police asked Jacob about every scrap of his life with a dispassionate thoroughness that felt like a verdict being formed rather than questions being asked. He told them the truth. He had been with Amanda when he could. He had accepted an envelope on a night when the roof on Mariam's house leaked like an old wound. He had lifted the boy in his arms and felt something that made his throat close: love, fear, responsibility. He had never hurt a child. He had never trafficked anyone. The officers took notes as if they were building a mosaic. "You were seen late leaving the house," one said, as if sight formed a law. "There are receipts that suggest financial exchange between you and the Okoro household." Another officer's voice softened into the kind of pity that reads like indictment. Jacob felt the words land on his chest, like weights. A neighbor who had been paid for a job in the Okoro house was asked to sign a statement describing Jacob's movements. The neighbor did so. People have a way of telling the story that makes them feel safer. Outside the station, the city listened and repeated. Gossip moved in the way water does, finding low places and filling them. Amanda's name, like a stone dropped into a pond, sent ripples outward. Reporters called with the clinical curiosity of predators, their questions wrapped in the public's hunger for drama. Family friends called with advice that read as accusation. "People are talking," one said. "You should be careful whom you trust." At home, Amanda kept the blind boy close. She read the same book out loud 3 times because he liked the sound of certain words. She brushed his hair and felt the ache like a bruise. Her world had shrunk and then ballooned in a way that made her dizzy. The child might be missing. The man who loved her could be branded. If she constructed silence to shield herself before, the silence now became a furnace, under which decisions forged themselves. On a rain-soaked evening, Jacob's house was invaded. Men with faces set like tasks broke through his simple door and left him lying on the floor, pain mapping itself across his body. They had not come to take anything of value. They had come to make sure his silence was purchased by bruises. They left a message, in bloodless terms. Do not interfere. Mariam sewed up wounds with a trembling hand, and a woman's steady attempt to make the world continue as if nothing had been changed. When Jacob stood again, he walked into a room where two forces angled at him: the law's suspicion and the household that both loved and needed him. He saw in Amanda's eyes a strain that had not been there before, and in Amaka's a satisfaction that was almost clinical. He recognized the shape of a conspiracy, but not its full measure. He remembered the warmth of the envelope, and felt it now as the weight that would later be called evidence. For Amanda, the moment when she realized the web was not a thing sprung by chance came like a stone you feel in your mouth, having swallowed it accidentally. A nurse, trying to be careful, dropped a phrase about records and retention. "We keep backups for 7 years, the nurse said, almost apologetically. The words were a thread. She followed it to the hospital administration with a determination that was thin and sharp. Her voice did not waver, but was fueled by a thing beyond anger. The mechanical logic of a mother who will not be done for. The hospital's initial replies were bureaucratic kindnesses. Records are private, footage is subject to policy. She asked for something stronger. Show me everything from the night of the birth. They offered platitudes and spoke of privacy laws. She pushed. She is a woman who has learned how to make institutions bend toward truth, when truth is not a convenient guest. The first doors closed. The second opened. Somewhere in a server room, in a backup drive someone had forgotten to mention, there existed footage that did not want to be seen. In the bloodstream of an institution, a secret moves like an animal, quiet and nervous, and it takes patience to find it. Amanda had patience, now sharpened into the single point of rage that had always been love. She did not yet know what that footage would show, nor did she know the price that would be exacted on the man whose hands had once soothed her. She knew only the shape of a story that would need to be told, the image of a baby vanishing and the absurd cruelty that the world had made of a poor man. When the officers came to inform Jacob that he was now a person of interest, their language was soft as the closing of a trap. They spoke of interviews, of the need to be available to answer more questions. They pronounced the polite words of officials who must sound fair while they set in motion a chain of consequences. Jacob's eyes filled with a kind of private bewilderment that was not entirely fear. It was the dumbness of someone who finds the world rearranged and no longer knows where to find the door. Amanda stood outside the station and watched the door close. She felt the particulars of betrayal, how closely envy could be sewn into the seams of family. She held the blind boy in her arms and felt him breathe. She let his small body steady the rage inside her for a moment, like a hand on a fevered forehead. She thought of Jacob's calloused fingers and the milk he had taught himself to warm just so. She thought of Amaka's smile when she thought no one saw it. She did not yet see in any full way that the hospital had been the theatre, and that a bribe could be such a small, terrible actor. She did not yet understand Dr. Adme's steps toward his own small, desperate acts. But she felt the cord tighten. The first act of a story is seldom the last. The first lie is never the only one. Outside the room where witnesses signed statements and officers scribbled their impressions, a small, practical litigation of rumor began. A neighbor who had been paid for a job at the house signed a quick affidavit about seeing Jacob with a small package. Someone else came forward with a memory of seeing a man leave at a time that would now be read as damning. The evidence did not need to be true in the whole sense of the word. It only needed to be coherent in a way the public would accept. Amanda walked home in the rain with the boy asleep in a rental carrier. strapped close. Her mind had a map of wrongs to right, and a ledger growing like a scar. She had always wanted to be a mother in a way that refused the small compromises the world often demanded. Now she had to be a mother and a detective and a judge, and she had to act fast because public narratives consolidate into something harder than law. The next steps would be surgical. Ask for records, demand footage, pry at the institutional nails that hold secrets in place. Inside the Okoro house, Amaka read the evening paper with a faint, satisfied tilt to her lips. She left cups of tea half drunk and switched the television stations with an air of practiced detachment. Chisholm cleaned his nails with deliberation. They shared glances that were careful and contained. To them, the world was being corrected to the shape they preferred. To the men in the street, and to the officers in the station, the narrative was closing like a slow fist. That night, Amanda slept with an arm around the boy and fingers that would not let go. She dreamed not of proof, but of the day a camera would not lie. She dreamed of a screen that would show the truth and make the rumor wither. She dreamed of the day when the man with grease under his nails would come home without the world's indictment pressed against him. Outside, the city kept moving as if nothing had been altered. Inside, lives were rearranged. The grace of a mother's love had become dangerous in a way she had not understood. It had made her vulnerable to violence masked as family. It had made her open to betrayal that could be delayed, but not erased. She found herself thinking in small loops about the night of the birth, the rain, the midwife's laugh, the first cry. And she found herself, in a way she had never been before, willing to demand the truth from places that are rarely compelled to confess. The hospital would be the first wall she would batter. Jacob's life had been the first thing stacked against the wall. The two things were not disconnected. A secret is never lonely. It moves and seeks companionship. When Amanda sat across from the hospital administrator the next morning, she did not wear the soft politeness of a woman asking for a favor. She wore a patience sharpened by fear. "Show me the footage of the nursery," she said simply, as if she were ordering tea. The administrator's face gave no news. "We keep records in accordance with policy," he said. The phrase had all the careful distance of trained language. She pressed the point. "Not a clipping. Everything from the night I left." He looked at her the way a man looks at a weather warning, mildly inconvenienced. "We will need to review the request," he offered. "There are privacy considerations." Amanda's answer was a slow, heavy thing. "If you value truth more than policy, you will show me what you have." He shifted in his chair. He did not know he was about to open a door that would reveal the shape of greed. Across town, in a small, cheap room, where Dr. Admi's television played a program he no longer watched, he sat with his hands folded and his mouth moving around apologies he had never given aloud. He had taken money the way a drowning man takes air, without thinking about the breath after. The money had relieved him of some immediate aches, unpaid fees, the mortgage that had been a headache for years. He had not imagined the child of that choice would be a drama that rewired a life. He had not imagined surveillance or conscience would outpace his attempt to hide. Now that the tide had turned, he felt both the relief and the terror of a man who knows he has been seen. In the corner of the house where old grudges live, Amaka arranged the evening like a small victory. She had not dreamed the scene would be so easy. She had prepared for resistance. She had thought of the ledger in the years when opportunity and envy sit together like conspirators. She had thought of her boys, and how a position in a household might be turned into something permanent if you were determined enough to seed the ground. But seeds sometimes take a life into their roots that cannot be recovered. She watched the headlines as if watching tide levels, and adjusted her face to the public. She spoke to Chisholm with a voice that was all practice. "We must be careful," she said. "We must not be seen to gloat." Chisholm nodded as if he were reading from an instruction manual. Amanda's path became a narrowing hallway of questions. She called a lawyer she knew socially, and the lawyer's tone was a mixture of efficiency and the kind of pity that reads like consolation. She asked the hospital to show her anything they had. Backup footage, archived drives, something. They answered with the measured tones of people who had not yet been asked to confess. At the police station, Jacob sat under lights that made every bruise more acute. They had not taken him away in handcuffs yet, but they had made the posture of suspicion a brace he had to wear. He thought of Mariam and of the children who would see their father's name bend under rumor. He thought of Amanda and the feeling that their love was now sticky with accusation. His thoughts kept returning to the strange object in his bag that he had never seen before, to the envelope he had taken with gratitude, to the men who had come into his house with faces like smoothed stones. The world had blurred the fine lines into thick brush accusations, and he stood in the middle of the painting. Amanda left the house with the boy pressed to her chest, and walked toward the hospital's administrative door, with a resolve she had not felt before. She would find the footage or demand an explanation. She would force a reality that made sense, and not accept the rumor as law. But she also carried in the hollows of her palms the knowledge that truth would come with costs. A name dragged through the mud, a man who would be publicly carved into a villain before anyone had proven a thing. She had not wanted that. She had not planned for that. The universe of her maternal love had made enemies out of some truth she had not known to guard for. She opened the hospital's door and pulled the bell of consequence. The days that followed would be louder and more bone-wearied than the slow hum she had known. The public would want a suspect. The police would like a narrative they could box into evidence. The family would show its teeth and its charm in equal measures. Amanda did not yet know the full extent of the deception that had been practiced in the room where children slept, nor did she yet have the footage that would answer the question of who had placed absence into her life. She only knew the outline. Jacob dragged toward suspicion, the hospital's guarded corridors, Amarka's smile, and the boy's containment. She knew she had to follow the trail into places that had no mercy for small men. At the threshold, with the lullaby a thin thread in her head, Amanda steadied herself and pushed through into bureaucracy that rarely surrendered secrets without a fight. Outside, the city pulsed on like a living thing, indifferent, ancient, impatient, while inside, evidence began to gather like tinder. One spark could set it ablaze. When she stepped into the administration office, the man behind the desk looked up from a file with the same disinterested expression civil servants cultivate. "We'll see what's possible," he said, and she felt acutely the law's tendency to be both gatekeeper and barrier. She did not yet know his sympathies, but she knew she would not be gentle. Not now. As the doors closed behind her, Jacob sat on a bench and watched the world pass like a train he had missed. Someone tapped his shoulder and told him to come in for another interview. He rose, not with hope, but with a readiness that hurt. The night before had been violent. His hands shook as he moved. He understood that being poor had become a form of evidence against him. He understood, too, that some people already had their verdicts handed down. The city, in the way of stories, was leaning over the edge of an argument. A single CCTV clip, a single tape, a single DNA result could undo a public judgment in the most literal way. But how to find it? And how to do so before rumor became an indictment? Amanda walked toward the records room with the urgency of someone who would not be denied. She did not yet know that the truth sits in cold servers and in the pockets of men who take money when they feel cornered. She did not yet know how many people would be put behind doors, or how many would walk away unscathed. She only knew that a baby had vanished, that a poor mechanic was being pressed into the shape of a criminal, and that she would not be able to sleep again until the machine of justice, flawed and cumbersome, began to turn toward the light. The records room smelled of paper and a faint, dry heat, as if old files gave off the memory of small secret fires. Amanda stood with her palms flat on the metal table and watched a man whose job was to preserve other people's facts become suddenly very small. He had rehearsed the line about privacy policy until it resembled doctrine. He now offered it like armor. Amanda listened until patience thinned into a blade. "Not a clipping," she said again, quietly. "Everything from the night of my son's birth, backups, archives, the whole feed." The man looked at the file, at the list of forms, at the signature she had demanded from the hospital lawyer she'd called that morning. His mouth tightened. "It's not that simple," he said, which was the old way of saying someone had to be pushed. Outside, the hospital hummed. Elevators sighed, trolleys rattled, the constant anonymous sound of people moving without story. Inside, Amanda's world narrowed to the rectangle of a screen. She would not accept not simple. She had borne losses that taught her how to sharpen an institution's delays into admission. She had time now. She would spend it like a weapon. A lawyer's letter arrived by hand that afternoon. It carried the small formalities that make private things public, a demand for preservation, a notice that records would be subpoenaed if not voluntarily produced. The administrator folded the paper and set it on the desk as if it were a pebble. Behind him, a technician, young, reticent, ran a hand along a keyboard and keyed into a system Amanda had always assumed was invisible. He said little, and his eyes avoided hers. That avoidance read like conscience. Amanda watched the monitor as if it might cough up a truth. The footage, when it came, was grainy, the kind of hospital tape that lived on in the dull light between births. Cameras caught corridors and doors, the slow choreography of nurses in clogs. The footage did not show motives or ledger entries. It showed hands and movements. It showed a woman who moved with practiced ease through a nursery, whose gestures were not those of a mere visitor. It showed a doctor whose hesitant touch betrayed something heavier than a tired shift. It showed, in the compressed, indifferent logic of a camera, an exchange that did not need narration to be understood. Amanda watched, as if a film had been made of the night, and she had been the only person not given a copy. The time stamped along the bottom of the screen did not need translation. A hand offering an object, a man's fingers closing on it, a carriage sliding along a bed of babies. The montage ended with a woman pulling a blanket close, walking away with the air of someone who had kept her intentions hidden beneath ordinary motion. She felt the room tilt. Somewhere in that tilt, the world she had trusted, bloodlines, tidy families, the assumption that grief could be contained, slid. The image settled into the soft leaden place in Amanda's ribs, where a mother's terror lived. The room filled with the small, present sound of equipment, a nurse's cough, the technician's soft drawl as he explained, "We keep backups to comply with audits." He seemed surprised by how little the phrase consoled anyone. Amanda left the hospital with a printout of the footage's timestamp, and the quiet certainty of someone who had just found an answer she had not known she would ever be allowed. She did not run to the police with an impetuous roar. She moved with a methodical coldness, the sort of step a woman takes when she knows people will try to turn truth into rumor. She had the tape. She had a lawyer. She had a moral right that did not respect public convenience. Word moved faster than law. The image that had once been only her secret now circled in rooms where the quiet gossip of the powerful stitched itself into action. She called Jacob before she called anyone else, because there were some terrors that needed witness more than counsel. He picked up on the second ring, his voice brittle with worry. "We found something," she said. She avoided saying the word that would reshape him, accused, because she wanted to measure his breath before the world pressed down. On the other side of town, Amarka folded her hands and pretended the newspaper's hysteria was a distant weather report. She paced in a rhythm almost ceremonial and met Chisholm's eyes across the table. He held a quiet that had the hollowness of a person who had rehearsed calm too often. He answered only in gestures, a slight tilt of head, the practiced contempt that had begun to look like self-control. "We must be careful," Amaka said in a voice wrapped in honey. "There are people who speak for pennies." Chisam's gaze flicked to his phone, then away. He had not thought to count how many people would speak for pennies, and how many would speak for nothing at all. Now, as headlines tightened and a few local bloggers smelled blood, he felt the heat of exposure. He had done the work of planting breadcrumbs well. He had not imagined the light the breadcrumbs would call. At Jacob's small house, Mariam watched the news like a woman watching a storm gather. A headline that suggested the mechanic had disappeared with a baby read like a blow. People in the compound asked questions they had not asked before. Children were instructed to avoid speaking to certain curious strangers. The men in the yard looked at Jacob differently, some with sympathy, others with a furtive edge that made his shoulders slump. He had been made an emblem of suspicion, not by an act he had committed, but by the shape of his life. The police asked for more time, and time is an ally to rumor. They visited the Okoro house to take statements. They subpoenaed records and seized devices. A reporter arrived early at Jacob Street and found a neighbor willing to amplify a half-memory. An envelope of cash, once private, once an answer to a leaking roof, was presented as evidence, awkwardly labeled on a plastic tray. The narrative assembled itself like a mosaic. It required only that observers fit the pieces into the picture the public expected. A poor man, a wealthy household, a child made absent. The police, bound by procedure but not immune to the gravity of public outrage, advanced a case built on circumstantial logic. A timeline created by the planted tag, and by a set of images of Jacob at the mansion, grainy but coherent, landed on a desk. A witness, an anonymous tipster, claimed to have spotted his silhouette leaving in the night. The officers, eager to hold the public's trust in their hands, moved to detain. Jacob was taken in for questioning, with the sort of quiet dignity that pretends to fairness and smells faintly of inevitability. The interrogation room had a small window and an echo. Jacob's hands found each other as if in prayer. He answered the same questions he had once answered on a bench under less suspicious lights. Only now each answer was an element in a legal machine designed to weigh intentions. He said he had loved the child. He said he had accepted money for his family in the way a man accepts a rope to climb out of a pit. He said he had never sold anyone. The officers listened and wrote in shorthand. "You were seen leaving late at night," one said, and when Jacob told the truth, he had gone to check on a leak. He had been given an envelope. His words sat like evidence that could be reinterpreted. The planted tag gave the officers a timeline. His movements could be reconstructed into a narrative of intent. The envelope became a symbol rather than a fact. The public feeds on symbols. Amanda, hearing the news of Jacob's detention, felt the familiar spasm of panic and a newer, sharper iron of resolve. She had seen how quickly a story could harden. She also felt the humiliation being inflicted on a man she loved. The particular cruelty of public suspicion was that it braided shame and guilt into a single rope. She arrived at the station and sat across from Jacob, who looked as if the world had taken his hands and wrung out his certainty. He tried to make a joke, and it left his throat thin. Mariam stood in the doorway like a hurricane waiting to be let loose. Amanda's anger was a low, steady thing. She thought of the film on a hospital monitor, of a hand that moved like a seamstress taking a stitch, of a doctor whose need had been the thin, consuming thing that had begun the chain. "We'll find this," she told Jacob, but words felt small. They were not remedies. They were promises. Meanwhile, Dr. Admi had been summoned by officers who had begun to read the footage the way a public reads a scandal. He had been small in the records she held, a man who had taken a path that made his nights tremble. He sat with his hands folded on a table and a confession that tasted of acid. The first thing he did was not legal. He called a number he had promised himself he would never call again. He tried to explain to the person on the other end how easy it had been to take money when the walls of his life were leaned upon by debt. The person who listened was not mercy. Under pressure, and under the weight of the footage, Dr. Adme's will dissolved like sugar in hot water. He told the officers how he had been paid in a small room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and exhausted integrity. He told them about the night, about the exchange, about a woman who had moved with such confidence he had mistaken her for compassion. He said the words of a man who knows that his act had been the hinge of other people's suffering. "I was desperate," he said. And then later, "I am sorry." Confessions do not roll out smooth. They rip the confessor and the confessed in jagged ways. Adme's admission gave the police a lead and a legal rope to pull. It allowed them to follow the thread to those who had benefited most from the arrangement. It also detonated the facade Amarka had carefully cultivated. When they came to arrest Amarka, she had the careful expression of someone who believed the law to be a performance she could outlast. She did not shout. She did not scream. She folded her arms like an audience waiting to be convinced. Chisholm's face, however, betrayed something less practiced. He flicked a gaze at Emma, who kept his face smooth and blank. They were taken with the same careful hand that takes a chess piece off the board. Amarka was read her rights. Chisholm's jaw clenched. Emma looked as if bored. The cameras that had not captured the night of the birth were suddenly present in other ways. Phones clicked, news vans gathered, neighbors watched. The household's quiet facade fell away like a dress being removed in haste. News of the arrests exploded across the city. Headlines shifted, rearranged, a narrative the public had scooped into shape, of a poor man who must have done the unthinkable, crumbled into a different kind of horror. The story of a wealthy woman who had traded a night's cash for a child's life. People who earlier had whispered over the convenience of a tidy scandal now had to reckon with the uglier truth. The law had been bent by money, and the weakest had been blamed. But truth is a slow alchemist. It takes time to transmute rumor into justice. The public wanted answers fast, and for a while, rumor had run ahead of fact. Even as Amarka and her sons were led away, many eyebrows remained raised at the speed with which the evidence had been gathered. Some in the press criticized the timing. Some in the public worried that the poor man's name had already been stained beyond repair. Jacob's detention did not evaporate at once, simply because other, more damning evidence had appeared. The social record keeps its stains. Amanda stood in the hallway of the police station as the reality of what she had seen sank deeper. She held a photograph, chosen frames of the footage printed and placed in an evidence bag. Her hands trembled, but she did not look away. She had the sensation of walking into a room that had been emptied and discovering it full again. The loss remained. Years of time could not be recovered. A child had been raised in a home that was not his, for reasons that would take years of courtrooms to disentangle. The next stage moved in the quiet arithmetic of labs and procedure. The orphanage where Philip had lived was visited with the gentleness that institutions reserve for their most delicate tasks. A search through records, a check of admission forms, an appeal to conscience. Sister Ebeli, who had folded her life into the schedules and the prayer books of the orphanage, opened binders and remembered names and faces. She had kept Philip safe enough for him to grow into a clever boy who read with an urgency that looked like prayer. She answered questions with the same efficiency that had kept the place functioning. DNA tests were ordered with a careful attention to chain of custody. Samples taken from Philip, from Amanda, from Jacob, each swab placed in climate-controlled envelopes, each label checked twice. The technicians' gloves were sterile, and the fluorescent labels glowed like small promises. For Amanda, These were not clinical instruments. They were incantations to a sensible world. Quanta, certainty, fact. She placed her cheek to her son's hair and watched the machines hum. While the lab worked, the police reconstructed the story. Pieces slotted into place, the bribe, the swap, the orphanage placement. Chisholm's pattern of cruelty emerged from staff accounts, the way he watched, the small acts that had burdened a household with a secret cruelty. Staff at the mansion, quiet, professional people whose loyalties were complicated by wages and fear, began to talk when the law offered them a chance to breathe. Stories surfaced in fragments. A door left unlocked, a staff rota adjusted, a small payment understood now as a bribe. Mariam and Jacob sat in a small room with a tea that had grown cold. Mariam's hands had been busy since the first bruises. She listened to the updates in a silence that was not acceptance, but a practical hunger for next steps. Jacob looked at the photo of the boy he had helped to raise. The image of him holding a child he had loved and protected and then been accused of stealing looked like a painting where the colors had been smeared by someone else's hand. "You thought the envelope was help," Mariam said at last, in the low voice of a woman who had learned to measure her words like currency. "You thought you were doing the right thing." Jacob nodded. He had been, and in that fact there was both shame and relief. He had not been the agent of a crime. He had been its victim. A public statement by the police acknowledged the evidence against Amarka and the arrest of Dr. Admi. The words were factual and cautious. They did not contain the tenderness Amanda wanted. Not yet. In the press briefings, a police officer took on the task of exoneration with the measured language of spokesman. "Our investigation will ensure that all individuals are treated fairly under the law," he said. It was bureaucratic balm. It did not heal the city's appetite for scandal. The lab result arrived in the small hours. DNA matched Philip to Amanda and to Jacob. A sample that had been swabbed at the orphanage disclosed the molecular truth. The numbers were clinical and telling in their silence. For Amanda, the confirmation arrived like light through a crack. It was not the drama of rescue, but the slow, thorough reset of a ledger. She called Jacob and told him with the same tenderness one might use when relaying good news that must still be handled with care. They arranged to reclaim Philip from the orphanage with the slow choreography of institutions. A guard at the door, a pile of documents, hands shaking as a boy who had been promised little was handed into arms that had once dreamt of him. Philip, when he saw Amanda, reacted in a way that was both immediate and restrained. Years of hunger for a name, and then the complicated introduction to someone who had been both absent and desired. He listened more than he spoke at first. He watched Amanda's face, measuring it like a map. Their reunion was not like a film of instantaneous healing. It was a careful, sometimes halting thing. There were questions Philip had that had been born of hard days. Why had he been left? Who had wanted him gone? Amanda answered with the simplest honesty she could muster. She kept no grand promises. She held his shoulders and let him decide how much tenderness he might accept. Back home, Peter, blind, tender, the child Amanda had raised, handled the new reality with the quietness learning had taught him. He smelled the changes on the air and felt the way staff moved differently. Amanda watched him like someone who had been given the impossible, 2 sons and a complicated future. She understood the moral knot she now wore across her chest, a knot of love, responsibility, and the knowledge that what was best for one might not be the same for the other. The legal machine turned. Arrests for Amarka, Chisholm, Emma, and Dr. Admi moved from handcuffs to custody to charges. The initial hearings were formal and full of sound, lawyers clearing throats, the steady reading of charges, the droning of cameras. Amarka sat with an expression that oscillated between feigned dignity and something like calculation. Chisholm's face hardened like a mask. Emma's composure was brittle. The public watch did not stop at arrests. Opinion moved in circles. Some condemned Amaka's cruelty and the corruption that had enabled her. Others considered how quickly a poor man had been suspected and how long such suspicion could linger. For Jacob, the formal exoneration in the case files did not unmake the humiliation of being taken in a squad car or the days of questioning that had felt like a public crucible. Even with DNA and footage, reputations do not return like loaned books. They remain marked. Amanda, as the case moved into the charged air of a courtroom future, found herself becoming an advocate not only for her child, but for the fragile men whose lives had been bulldozed by rumor. She hired counsel, who understood the media's appetite for spectacle and the law's patience for proof. She sought to make reparation in ways that were not merely legal. Public statements, a donation to repair Jacob's roof, a quiet payment that recognized how her earlier act of charity had been used as a weapon. Jacob walked into a clearing of different kind. He was again a man with a name untainted by crime papers, but his posture had changed. He moved through the neighborhood and felt the altered registrations of eyes on him. Some greeted him with apology. Others could not unlearn the smell of rumor. Mariam went back to work when she could. Their children resumed something like normalcy. There were still nights when Jacob woke up with the phantom hands from the beating, and there were afternoons when he watched the news and felt parts of his dignity behave like broken glass. Amanda, who had been the story's moral center since the day she sat rocking a chair that had once seen a husband's absence, did not bask in vindication. She felt a sorrow that had dimensions beyond the discovery. A child had been taken from the life she had imagined for him. A household had been violated. A man she'd loved had been pilloried by the public. The revelation of truth did not wash away every wound. The blind boy Peter needed therapy that was not purely medical. The staff arranged counseling. A schedule of appointments and careful sessions began to fold into the household. Peter's trauma was not told in sensational detail. It was in how he flinched at unexpected touches, how he sometimes searched for faces that weren't there. Amanda sat across from him in quiet rooms and hummed the lullaby until the sound became a salve. She promised him, in the slow way she had learned with weariness, that her love would not be divided by the law of blood. Philip, newly introduced to the wealth he had once lacked, moved through the opulent rooms with a curiosity that bordered on wariness. He had gifts, a quick mind, a hunger for knowledge, and Amanda arranged tutors who could coax what had been starved into bloom. She also knew that money could not mend every tear. It could not unmake the orphanage's shadows in which he had learned certain survival skills. She took him to the hospital where he had been born, to sit in the same hallway where the footage had been played for her, as a way to give him a map of his past. She walked with him to the window that looked out on a city and told him, quietly, that truth had found them late, but it had found them nonetheless. In the wake of arrests, Amaka's demeanor changed as courtroom realities imposed themselves. Her defenses, once polished, revealed cracks. The legal process unspooled things she had wanted, kept buried. Bank transfers, conversations, the men who had been paid. She began to understand the scale of what she had set in motion. Pride had cost her a child, dignity, a freedom she had assumed was immutable. Chisholm's cruelty, when described in court, was catalogued as the small habitual violences that become monstrous when spread over years. Staff members, now freed from fear by the substance of evidence, told stories in fragments. Moments when a child had been deliberately hurt. Times when a household's comforts were weaponized. The courtroom did not need to invent the malevolence. It simply named it. But the legal world is not moral theatre. It is a place of motions, of adjournments, of negotiation. Pleas could be entered. Attorneys whispered deals. The story's public appetite for clarity ran up against the law's meticulous pace. Amanda found the waiting brutal and necessary. She sat through pre-trial dates and motions with a tiredness sharpened by the truth. Justice would not come quickly enough to unmake the years of pain. Outside the courthouse, the city talked in the way cities do. Some voices demanded harsher sentences, others pointed to systemic failure. The way money had bent institutions, the way class had shaped suspicion. Conversations turned toward policy, how hospitals safeguard records, how staff are screened, how those with influence can manipulate a system. Amanda listened, partly because she had to, partly because the discourse could become a blade that cut open the place where others' suffering had been hidden. There were quieter consequences too. Some friends who had seemed sure at first drifted away, unwilling to anchor themselves in a storm that smelled of scandal. Sponsors murmured about reputational risk. A board member of Amanda's charity resigned, citing the need to keep focus on institutional work rather than personal drama. These small betrayals hurt in ways that did not make the news, but reshaped the world she had tried to build. Jacob, at home again, found that some of the small indignities persisted. Men in the market would occasionally whisper. Children at school would ask his children awkward questions. The stain of suspicion had become a social scar. He tried to return to work, with a concentration that sometimes failed him. Hands that had once been steady at a wrench shivered under the pressure of new attention. Yet, there were also handholds that had not existed before. Amanda arranged for work on Jacob's house, paid for medical bills that had accumulated, and made a public statement, short, restrained, about correcting a wrong. She made a quiet gift to the orphanage for the staff who had cared for Philip, and for the institutional lacunae that had allowed the swap to go unnoticed. She knew restitution could not erase every harm, but it could set in motion a different story. At night, she read aloud to Peter and to Philip, in the same voice she had used on the first night she had thought she might lose them. She tried to teach them both to find words for the things they did not yet understand. They learned separately and in small, overlapping moments. The smell of coffee in the kitchen, a hand on a shoulder that steadied, a lullaby hummed like an anchor. The criminal case moved slowly. Arraignments, a plea of not guilty from a marker, accusations met with denials that were less convincing each day. Chisholm, who had cultivated a silence like armor, watched as a state's attorney described the business of exchange and the cost it exacted. Dr. Anthony, who had stood in the doorway of his own conscience and then crossed, pleaded guilty to charges related to the swap. His remorse was thin and practical in court, measured in the language of someone who had exchanged risk for money. As the months wore on, the city's attention drifted a little, as news cycles will do. But for those who had lived through the small, sharp violence of the swap, the repercussions remained. Amanda sat at meetings with lawyers while the boys learned to be brothers of a kind they had never been asked to imagine. She made choices, some public, some private, about how to raise two children who had begun life by being divided. Jacob, whose name the papers had once printed with an implied guilt, walked into a community event, months later, where he was greeted by some with cautious smiles, and by others with palpable wariness. Amanda introduced him at a small foundation dinner. She told a story of how communities protect their weakest, and how easy it is to let rumor take the place of truth. Her remarks were brief, aimed not at clattering triumph, but at a recognition that social repair takes time. In private, she visited a marker in custody. The meeting room smelled of antiseptic and the kind of silence prisons cultivate. A marker did not weep. She sat straight, with a dignity that looked like training. Amanda could have yelled, could have demanded 1,000 small revenges. Instead, she asked questions about motive in a slow, careful voice. Amarka's answers were couched in bitterness that had been cultivated like a shrub. She spoke of years of being told she deserved less, of a life sharpened by a belief that the world had rewarded Amanda unfairly. Her voice was not tender. It was brittle. She did not apologize in the way Amanda wanted. "How do you undo what you did?" Amanda asked at last. "Some things you cannot," Amaka said. "You can only pay as you must." That answer was not consolation. In the months after the revelations, criminal proceedings opened windows into a private theater of envy and planning. Witnesses from the hospital described discomfort at the hush of suggested payments. Staff from Amaka's household, some of whom had been bought by fear or flattery, testified to small changes in routine that, together, explained how the swap had been possible. The law, in its long, uneven machinery, began to hold a mirror up to the way power can bend institutions. Yet even as justice took its slow steps, another reality settled in the home Amanda had rebuilt. Neither child was entirely whole, and neither could take the full place the other had been denied. There were nights when Peter woke, disoriented and afraid, searching with hands for a face that his vision could not find. There were days when Philip hesitated at the threshold of a room that smelled like stranger's perfume, and then found his mother's voice and settled. Amanda became adept at small acts of repair, a tutor for Philip, who understood the orphanage's language, a therapist for Peter who specialized in the particular terrors blind children can internalize, a coach for the household staff who needed to learn how to be safe and honest. She learned to resist the public's theatrical appetite for closure and to instead fold time into slow, steady care. There were moments of tenderness that felt like reparation in their own right. Jacob taught Philip how to change a tire in the cool afternoon light, and the boy's laughter at a lesson that turned oil-stained hands into a language of trust was like a small sanction against the cruelty of years. Peter learned to trust hands again when he could feel another's face without flinching. Amanda watched them, these small, ordinary miracles, and knew not to speak too loud. Miracles, when named, sometimes become fragile. But the story had not ended. Amaka's children, particularly Chisholm, sat in a cell with wind around the bones, silence. Chisholm's rage had been a cultivated thing. He had found power in cruelty, and the world did not unmake him easily. The court's work would take time. The cultural work of examining how wealth can twist small acts into harms would take longer still. There remained a sense that the wound had spread beyond a family. It had touched an institution, a city, a culture that rewarded discretion to the well-placed and suspicion to the poor. Amanda spoke at a small panel months after the arrests, her voice steady, in a room that smelled of coffee and legal pads. She did not seek the limelight. She wanted systems to change. She spoke about hospital accountability, about the moral failure of a system that allowed a desperate doctor to be bought, and about the way public suspicion activates easiest at the poor man's door. She called for better checks, for protections of the vulnerable, but her words were less about policy than they were about human consequences. The faces of two boys who had both been plucked and placed. Jacob rebuilt his life quietly. He repaired a generator for a school and accepted the applause that came with a small community gesture. He found dignity in work and the support of people who had watched him carry shame and then watch it lifted. He and Mariam saved small things, some money for a repair, some rice for a rainy week. The public apology that came from certain columns was not enough to erase the nights he had spent under bright interrogation lights, but it served as an official acknowledgement that the world had erred. The final legal acts in the story's first chapter came with hearings and statements that resolved facts, but left feelings loose. Amaka and Chisholm faced charges that could carry years. Dr. Admi pleaded guilty to corruption and negligence. His career in medicine ended with a sentence that matched a public need for condemnation, if not full restitution. Emma, whose role had been less public, took a deal that would keep him out of deeper legal entanglements, but would not restore certain moral failures. Amanda, whose life had been a ledger of grief and rescue, held both boys in a home that would now accommodate two histories. She did not pretend the arrangement was easy. She made promises to both, to Philip, patience, and a guide into a world he had been denied. To Peter, care and protection that would not see him defined by what he did not have. She became a mother in a new, expanded sense, a guardian not only of bodies, but of futures scarred by deceit. The city moved on, as cities do, but the story of a baby who vanished, and of a poor man who was nearly crushed by rumor, lingered in conversations like a stain that could not be scrubbed away completely. People debated the law and whispered about charity gone wrong, and about what it meant to be poor in a society that instinctively looks toward the disadvantaged when something terrible occurs. By the time the first-year anniversaries passed, the boys had begun to form a new domestic rhythm. Philip, with a strange mixture of relief and wariness, accepted the trappings of a life that had once been denied. Peter, whose world had been darkness and sound, adjusted to new names and new tutors, who taught him to map space by touch. Their laughter, when it came, was not ornamental. It was evidence that human beings can adapt even when history has been cruel. Amanda never stopped looking sometimes at the empty place of the very first grief. The late husband's chair, the echo of a life that had shaped her decisions. She also moved forward, with a ledger that had been rewritten, and a community that had shown both its worst and its best. She had reclaimed a son. She had kept another. She had exonerated a man she loved and paid with political capital in the process. She had learned that truth often arrives late, and never without cost. But the story did not end in neat closure. In prison, some conversations are seeds. In the house where Amaka's servants once kept stories, new whispers took root. Legal appeals hum like a distant insect. Chisholm's temper did not dissolve in custody. It hardened into something that might yet be troublesome once a trial ended. The law had done this much: arrest, charge, prepare for trial. It had not yet smoked out every accomplice or settled every public question. Amanda closed her eyes one evening and listened to the house. The faint tapping of rain, the soft breaths of two children who had found shelter in the same bed of complicated love. She hummed the lullaby she had once kept like a secret, and both boys stirred at the sound, comforted by a voice that had been turned toward them. She thought of Jacob, asleep across the room, his hands calloused, his presence a hard-won peace. She thought of the hospital monitors and the footage that had been the hinge. She thought of the way small, desperate acts ripple into monstrous things. There would be court dates and appeals. There would be a long report in some policy journal about institutional failure. There would be commentators who argued in favor of systems and those who argued against them. There would be, as well, quieter things. Nights when Peter would cry for reasons that had nothing to do with law. Mornings when Philip would stare at a photograph of a nun and wonder about the texture of a life before he had a name. Amanda had learned that retribution, when deserved, must be accompanied by repair. She spent herself on both. She testified in court with a voice that carried both hurt and the kind of moral clarity that has been sharpened by loss. She demanded accountability, not spectacle. She demanded that hospitals guard their wards not because she was seeking vengeance, but because she wanted no other mother to learn the cost she had. And so the chapter closed on a house with two boys and a man who had been exonerated, but who would always carry the marks of accusation. The city watched as the legal wheels turned, and some people, those who had loved a neat story, moved on. Others sat with the facts like a weight. Institutions had failed, envy had been weaponized, and a poor mechanic had become the prime suspect in a crime he did not commit. Amanda, turning the last page of this long, bitter section of her life, did one thing that the cameras did not record. She wrote a list. Not of legal actions, not of names to hate, but of small promises, tutors to hire, therapists to meet, friends to call, and a long-term plan to establish a fund for children like Philip and Peter, those who had been hurt by secrecy and carelessness. It was not because she wanted to make a splash. It was because she had come to understand that the quiet, patient work of repairing lives is the only real remedy. There would be more to come: the trial, the negotiations, perhaps appeals to public opinion, and the whisper of revenge that travels even through prison bars. But in the rooms of her house, as night deepened and the city lights dimmed, Amanda folded her hands around the two boys who had been placed in her care by fate and malice both. She did not look for absolution. She only looked for a way to keep them safe in a world that had nearly taken both. If this chapter has gripped you, and you want to follow what comes when courthouses open and reputations are rebuilt or crushed, subscribe so you don't miss the next part of Amanda's fight for justice. Tell us in the comments, who do you think paid the heaviest price when truth arrived? The law will do what laws do. We will watch who learns from the ruin left behind.